Good. Okay, so Mike said he wants me to talk about globalization. Yeah? So, why not? I always do what I'm told. So, what's globalization? Actually, the best definition of it I know of, if I can remember it, is by a very well-known development economist, Canadian development economist, guy named Gerald Helleiner, who tried to summarize it in a little ditty, which went something like this. Don't hold me to the exact words. He said, "The poor complain, they always do, but that's just idle chatter. Our system brings rewards to all, at least to all who matter." That essentially captures it. Okay, I can go home. So the only question is, how do the poor complain? Why is it idle chatter? Who are the poor? Who matters? And so on. So what about the poor complaining? Actually, they do complain, and they complain very loudly and in very interesting ways. So, for example, in April of this year, a couple of weeks ago, there were the first ever meeting of the heads of state of what's called G77. It's actually like 133 or so now, representing, accounting for, there's a difference, accounting for roughly 80% of the world's population. They had their first really high-level meeting in Havana in April. A week earlier, the foreign ministers had met in Cartagena in Colombia. And they came out and I don't know why they selected Havana, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a solidarity gesture, maybe. It was a very important meeting. These are what used to be called the non-aligned countries in the days when there was a space for non-alignment. That disappeared with the Soviet Union. There's no longer any space for non-alignment, and that means that the minimal attention that was once given to what's called the South has declined to virtually zero. You can see that in all kinds of ways, foreign aid, all kind of measures. They produced, this was their, as I said, first really high-level meeting ever, so an important one. They came out with a long, detailed declaration called the Declaration of the South Summit, which was highly critical of globalization, the particular form of globalization that's being instituted, that's essentially corporate-led globalization concerned with the interests of investors and lenders. Everything else is sort of incidental. And they called for a new era, a new global era, which would have a different orientation, which they then spelled out in some detail. The basic idea is that the new global form of global integration that they were calling for would give a primacy to the right of development, in fact, the right of independent development for the so-called developing countries, many of them developing downwards, unfortunately, the poor countries, the South, the former colonial world, and would permit them to pick their own development path without any form of economic coercion or pressure in terms of their own national priorities and interests, and opposed all forms of, they rejected completely all forms of unilateral economic sanctions. About half the world's population right now is under unilateral U.S. sanctions, so that's who they're talking to. And they also rejected forcefully what they called, this is their phrase, the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, which they consider just old-fashioned European imperialism under a very familiar garb of, righteous moralism, just as it had always been in the past. That's the gist of it, in a long, developed extensively. It's not the first time. Back in the 1960s, early 1970s, just at about the time of the onset of the era that is now called globalization in the West, there was also a kind of a South Summit, a non-aligned meeting, which called for a new international economic order of a similar kind. Not the same words and the same details, but roughly that. And including interesting proposals, which have had a lot of contemporary resonance. So that was about the time that, at that point, this was after about 10 or 15 years of decolonization, and there was a lot of energy and momentum in the non-aligned movement, which is essentially the decolonized countries for the most part. And they had succeeded in getting the United Nations to form the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, which was formed in 1964, and it still exists, and it's the major semi-independent economic analysis organization in the world, in fact, under UN auspices, come out with regular and sometimes important reports. UNCTAD was formed in order to, with a mandate. The mandate was to work on methods of global integration, international integration, that would be very much like what I just quoted from the South Summit, which would be concerned with the right of development, and in particular independent development, free of external coercion. And they came out with many specific proposals. Of course, this was totally dismissed by the rich countries. Nobody ever heard about it anymore. And UNCTAD itself was kind of marginalized, just as every aspect of the United Nations, every institution of the United Nations, which to some extent represents third world interests, interests of the South, has been either eliminated or pushed very far to the side. So UNCTAD still exists, but not in very powerful form. One of their proposals, one of them, a particularly important one, which has lots of contemporary implications, was a proposal to stabilize commodity prices. The South, the poor countries, are mostly were at the time, to some extent still are, still primary product producers. Every rich country, say the United States or European Union and so on, has internal programs to stabilize commodity prices. So there's various farm subsidies and so on. These are very high in the European Union, quite high in the United States. They've actually increased very radically in the last several years, right after Congress passed what was called a Freedom to Farm Act in 1996, which was designed to terminate subsidies and all other interferences with the holy market. And it did it in the usual way by leading to a tripling of subsidies in the next 2 years, almost all going to agribusiness and avoiding farmers. And the same is true of other countries, European Union, even more than the United States. The point of to try to keep farm prices more or less stable, commodity prices in general. Well, that was the proposal of UNCTAD, except that they were proposing it for the poor countries. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, if primary products oscillate rapidly, say coffee, to take a case that happens to be crucial, it's the second biggest commodity in international exchanges after oil. If coffee prices shoot way up and down, that has an effect. It does not affect agribusiness particularly. So big agribusiness can displace costs. You can take a loss here if coffee prices go way down. You can, say, take a loss here 1 year and make a profit somewhere else, or make a profit in some other part of your enterprise, and so on. On the other hand, a small farmer can't do that. If you're a small farmer and you happen to be a coffee farmer and a coffee producer, say in Colombia or Bolivia or somewhere, and coffee prices go down, you're finished. You can't tell your children, wait a year or two, maybe you'll be able to eat then. So you have to do something else. Well, what else you do is move to crops for which there is a stable market. There happens to be one export crop for which there is a stable market, and it happens to be grown in some of the major coffee-producing areas like the Andes, like Colombia. So yeah, that's what they moved to, and that move was accelerated by other programs, including those that are central to the so-called globalization period. I'll whenever I say globalization, I mean in quotes. What's called globalization is one specific modality of international integration. There's nothing wrong with international integration. In fact, it's a great thing. It's nice to meet people from other countries and all sorts of other stuff. But there are various forms of possible international integration, and the one that's called globalization is one particular one. Like, it's not the new international economic order that the South was calling for, and it's not the new global system that they're now calling for. It's a different one. This new one, the one that is called global, the official one, the one that Thomas Friedman writes laudatory books about and so on, that's the one that, among its other properties, are that countries have to open up their borders to free imports. So they have to accept imports from highly subsidized U.S. and European and Canadian agribusiness, which of course instantly wipes out domestic production for domestic needs, and that means that poor farmers are stuck. One thing they can do is flee to the cities, which has the nice effect that they create a massive labor force which lowers wages, and it means that U.S. and European manufacturers, or by now Japanese and Korean manufacturers who are putting, say, assembly plants or whatever abroad, can benefit from cheaper labor, and consequently wages can go down, and in fact do go down while the economy booms. Mexico is a dramatic case. But if farmers don't move to the urban slums to become an excess labor force, they again, and try to produce something, it can't be commodities for the domestic market for food, because they'll be wiped out by imported goods. So once again they move to they become what's called a rational peasant in the technical literature. A rational peasant is a peasant who understands that you have to produce for export and you have to seek the maximum profit. Okay, so you sort of spell that out: produce for export, stable markets, maximum profit. Well, you get the same answer as before: coca, poppies, and so on. And that's what's happening. So the globalization, in particular the undermining of the attempts of the South 30 years ago to create a form of globalization directed toward the interests of the developing world. That means almost the entire world. One of the major consequences of this, and it's no big secret, like you can read it in standard books of political economy and so on, was to greatly accelerate drug production of what we call drugs. I mean, they're not the most lethal drugs. The most lethal ones are produced in places like North Carolina, but what we call lethal drugs here, peasants have been driven to it. They really have no choices, in part by the choice, and it was a choice. It's not an economic law. The choice by the powerful states 30 years ago to institute a particular form of international economic integration, what's called globalization, in preference to another one, one which would have, for example, as one of its properties, and there were many others, things like stabilization of primary commodity prices, and what are called neoliberal programs, like opening up your borders to imports from subsidized agro-export from northern agribusiness. That has the same effect. There's a lot more like this. I mean, a lot of what happens to the rational peasants, incidentally, after they've learned their lessons properly. They kind of like the equivalent of going to Harvard or MIT or Chicago graduate school and getting a degree in economics, so they become rational peasants. Well, once they've learned the lesson, they're rewarded. They're rewarded with helicopter gunships that you and I pay for, with chemical and biological warfare, including new experimental biological techniques that will have who knows what effect, and by what's called here a drug war. That's the reward for having learned the lessons after having been essentially forced into a particular kind of production by the way globalization works out. That's one of its less discussed features. Going back to the Declaration of the South, the poor are complaining, as they always do. What they're calling for now, again, is a new international. They're calling for globalization, for international economic integration. They want this, but are calling for a form that will be based on the right of development, and in particular the right of independent development. Means no external compulsion on the choice of financial decisions and macroeconomic, socioeconomic measures, and so on and so forth. They won't get it. This is, remember, idle chatter. You can see the measure of how idle the chatter is was given by the coverage in, I didn't check other countries, but I suspect it's the same, in the United States, of the declaration of the heads of states of the South representing, again, accounting for, because they're not representative governments, accounting for 80% of the world's population. There was no mention of it. Our same friend, invaluable resource who does database searches for us, did one for me on this, and there was not, I couldn't find a word referring to the Declaration of the South Summit. So yes, the poor complain, they always do, but it's just idle chatter. You know, and we can now forget about it, just the way the calls for national international economic orders 30 years ago were forgotten about. What about the right of development? Well, that's a right that is rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you read the articles, the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration, around Article 23 to 25, around there, that expresses almost verbatim what's called the right of development. But that right doesn't mean anything. And it doesn't mean anything because it's vetoed by the United States. The United States has made it extremely clear that, has stated officially, in fact vetoed at the United Nations, an effort to turn the right of development into an actual commitment, not just words on paper. It was vetoed in 1990 by the U.S. when it came up at the UN, only by the U.S., on the grounds that it's, as the U.S. delegate Morris Abram put it, it's preposterous and provocation, you know, to call for the rights that are spelled out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's one of a number of respects in which the United States is pretty much at the lead of what are called relativists, people who reject a component of the Universal Declaration. The term relativist is used here in another sense. It's used for people who reject the ones that the U.S. theoretically, and only theoretically, is committed to, civil and political rights. They're called relativists. But the U.S. flatly rejects the socioeconomic rights, and they're all a unit. They all have the same status. It's very clear in the formation of the Universal Declaration that they're completely the same status throughout, except the U.S. rejects the status of the socioeconomic rights and hence the right of development. They're a letter to Santa Claus, as Gene Fitzpatrick put it rather elegantly, so we can forget about it. So that's also idle chatter, those parts of the Universal Declaration, and the right of development. They're concerned about the right of independent development because part of what's called globalization, Western-style globalization, is to eliminate the possibilities for independent economic planning, actually even to eliminate them for the rich countries. They are now compelled to accept what are called market decisions. That means the decisions of what some economists call a virtual Senate or a virtual parliament of investors and lenders who conduct I'm actually quoting the technical literature, conduct a moment-by-moment referendum on government policies. And if there's something they don't like, they veto it. That's called, in the technical literature, I think, a dual constituency conundrum, meaning governments have two, big complicated words, that's technical literature. The conundrum is that a government has two constituencies. In theory, let's say a pure democracy, you know, wonderful democracy, has two constituencies. One is its citizens, and the other is the virtual Senate, you know, who are carrying out this moment-by-moment referendum. And if the citizens decide on some policy, like, say, more money for education or health or whatever, that the other constituency regards as irrational, Irrational is kind of like the same word as in rational peasant. Irrational means it only helps people, not profits, so it's irrational. Then the other constituency just vetoes it. And the way they veto it is by attacking the currency, withdrawing capital, and acting in other ways, which are made possible by the initiation of the form of international integration that's now called globalization. That's something you can do in the last 30 years. You couldn't do it before. So that's part of what we call globalization. And that means about half the people in the world, not the same half as are under U.S. international sanctions, though they overlap. About half the people in the world are now, their countries are now technically in receivership. That means their policies are made in Washington by the U.S. Treasury and the IMF and the World Bank. And that's because of the debt stranglehold, which is also a nicely designed policy to ensure that the countries of the South essentially return to their colonial status. The debt is mostly an ideological construction. It's not really an economic fact. But it's, there's enough power behind it, so it becomes a fact, whatever you call it. And that forces countries into technical receivership. They lose any capacity to make their own decisions. The rich countries are also subject to this. So if the European Union or the United States, suppose if the United States decides to carry out a domestic stimulation program or whatever, stimulate the economy or cut back unemployment after the next recession or whatever it may be, they are subject to the same condition. And it's significant, even for a rich country. Actually, it worked in 1992 when Clinton came in and was proposed a mild stimulus to the economy. There was a recession at the time. And there was an immediate attack on the bond market, and capital started flowing out. And as the Wall Street Journal pointed out, you're getting a veto, from the, they didn't call it that, but what amounts to the virtual Senate. And they had to back off. I mean, maybe they could have withstood it, maybe not. But the point is, even the rich countries are subordinated to this form of decision-making in the hands of a very narrow group of lenders in this case. Same thing is true of investors. And that's part of the point of globalization, what we call globalization. Part of the point of it is to undermine sovereignty, popular sovereignty, to make it to take away the option of making decisions over what kind of country you want to live in and what kind of policies you want to have, to take this away and turn it to the proper hands, namely the concentrations of capital and handled by money managers for Wall Street and so on. That's what the idle chatter is discussing when they talk about independent economic planning. They mean they want to be able to carry out social and economic planning independent of the constituency of investors and lenders. And of course, that's exactly what's taken away from them by what we call globalization. When they oppose unilateral economic sanctions or other coercive economic measures, again, as I think I mentioned, they're referring to the United States, which is unique in imposing unilateral economic sanctions. In fact, even those that are not unilateral, that go through the United Nations, are usually with the U.S. initiative, like the Iraq ones. Some of these unilateral sanctions are flatly illegal. They're in violation of World Trade Organization rules. They're in violation of international law. That has been so declared, and it's not my opinion, by virtually every relevant international body. The most extreme sanctions, which violate every law in the book, are the ones against Cuba, and they've been around for 40 years. They have nothing to do with the Russians or anything else. In fact, we know what they have to do with, because the declassified record has explained it. They actually even ban food and medicine, which is flatly in violation of all international law. Even the Legal Commission of the Organization of American States, which is usually a very pliable, frightened body of countries, even they've declared it illegal. The European Union brought it to the World Trade Organization because it's in violation of World Trade Organization rules, involves secondary boycotts and so on. But the U.S. simply told them to get lost. They said that if it comes to a WTO panel and it rules against the United States, we'll disregard it. The U.S. claimed it's a national security exemption. We have to deprive Cuban children of medicine on grounds of national security, otherwise we'd be wiped out or something. And that was enough. You know, it was reported in the press. So that's unilateral sanctions. The so-called right of humanitarian intervention, well, it's another topic, but we know what they're talking about. This was the reaction of most of the world, as far as you can tell at least, during the period of the bombing last year. It was even U.S. client states like Israel, bitter condemnation, warning that this is just going to, that it is old-fashioned imperialism, that the moralism is fake, which it surely was, and that it's going to lead to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction as countries simply have to find some way to defend themselves against an international predator. And that reaction is now expressed by the countries that, again, account for 80% of the world's population. And stress the difference between account and represent. I mean, they don't represent people. These are mostly very unrepresentative governments. And that, in a way, makes the declaration even more significant, because these are pretty reactionary people who are producing this declaration. You know, they're not nice social democrats or something like that. In fact, they are also the people who basically gain from this particular form of globalization. It does benefit a sector of the society in the poor countries, and they're the ones who run the countries, but they're condemning it, and they're condemning the so-called right of humanitarian intervention and so on. Exactly the sectors in the South that you might expect to be most supportive of Western power. So you can one can only imagine what the attitudes of the populations are, but probably stronger. Well, as I say, it's idle chatter. No mention of it in the United States. Well, what's globalization again? It's approximately this. What's international integration, of which what we call globalization is a phase. Well, you know, international integration has been going on, you know, since the East India Company in 1600, but and in fact long before. I mean, long before there was all sorts of international integration around China and Japan and India and the major industrial and commercial centers of the world during the period of Asian dominance. In the modern period, let's say the last century and a half or so, there was an increase, sharp increase in international integration, globalization, if you like, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, up until the First World War. In fact, by gross measures like, you know, quantity of trade relative to world economy, that kind of measure, or even quantity of financial flow relative to the global economy, it's not different from what it was now, from what it is now, roughly on the same order of what it is now. In that respect, contemporary globalization, and at a gross level, contemporary globalization is a kind of return to the pre-World War I period. The period in between the wars was a period of decline of international integration, and then after the Second World War it started to grow again, and it's now back to roughly where it was before the First World War in rough terms, in gross terms. However, when you look more closely, there are differences, and they're very important differences. So one difference has to do with what constitutes world trade. The proportions aren't all that different from what they were, say, 100 years ago, but the constitution is very different. At that time, about 100 years ago, the trade was from the poor countries, the colonies they were at the time, mostly. They were mostly producing primary products, which were imported into the rich countries, which were returning manufacturing products, not many, in fact. Only about 10, I think roughly 10% of total world trade consisted of manufactured products. Almost all the rest was, it was all coming from the rich countries. The rest was primary products coming to the rich countries. Now it's very different. The figures are virtually reversed. About 90% of what constitutes world trade now is manufacturing and what are called services, financial tools and that sort of thing. So there's tremendous growth of manufacturing in world trade, and it's going in all directions. It's coming from the poor countries to the rich countries. Of course, overwhelmingly, it's coming from subsidiaries of multinationals in the rich countries back to the rich countries. So like, say, trade with Mexico there's plenty of manufactured goods coming from Mexico to the United States, but they're subsidiaries, overwhelmingly subsidiaries of U.S. corporations. In fact, one might ask the question whether this should be called trade at all. So between the United States and Mexico, probably maybe 2/3 of it, or roughly that order, of what's called trade is actually internal to a single firm. I mean, it's like General Motors sending parts to Mexico where they can be assembled and sent back to the United States and have more value added and then sold. These are centrally managed interactions. They have nothing to do with markets. These are centrally managed interactions within huge totalitarian institutions, which is what a corporation is. And they're about as close to totalitarian as anything human beings have devised, totally top-down, no accountability, and so on. So these are managed interactions internal to totalitarian institutions, which happen to cross a national boundary. Like if the same interactions went between, say, Illinois and Indiana, you wouldn't call it trade. The reason it goes to Mexico is because when it goes to Mexico, the corporation that's doing it can make various gains. For one thing, it can transfer prices freely. It can pretend it's getting its profits here and not there and so on, and that transfer of pricing, nobody can actually measure it, but it apparently amounts to a huge tax loss to the extra tax burden for the people in the rich countries. Okay, it's a way for corporations to not pay tax where they are. And if you don't pay tax, it means somebody else pays tax. So it shifts the tax burden over to the poor in the rich countries. Another reason is they get, of course, much cheaper labor. Now, according to economic theory, that doesn't happen. So any of you studied Econ 101 or read Paul Krugman in the New York Times and so on can explain exactly why this can't happen. There's a thing called the law of one price or something that says that if you liberalize trade, all the prices reach the same point. So that means if a worker in Mexico produces at the same level as a worker in the United States, same productivity, which they do, in fact, sometimes higher, then their wages go up to that point. And that's kind of an iron law of modern economics. The only trouble is it works the other way. As the world just doesn't cooperate. As the freeing up of the cross-border transactions increased under globalization, wages went down in Mexico. Since NAFTA was passed, they've gone down by in manufacturing wages have been gone down by about 25%. That's an increase during the period of liberalization in Mexico started in 1982, right after the so-called debt crisis. Then they introduced the neoliberal reforms. Since that time, wages went down about 50% in the first 10 years or so, and about another 25% since NAFTA. The reason is that there's something that isn't calculated in the economics texts, and that is that when Mexico's borders were opened to agricultural production from the United States, it drove millions of peasants off the farms. And they're, like I said before, where do they go? They don't commit suicide. They go into the cities where they form a huge cheap labor force, which lowers wage levels, and that happens to totally wipe out the effects of that come from the abstract models that they teach you about in graduate school. So the fact is that wages go down and continue to go down. You don't have to worry about pollution. And just to make sure that they stay down, Mexico has a pretty brutal government, which ensures that there isn't any labor organizing or any of this bad stuff. And they have what's called labor market flexibility. Labor market flexibility is a good thing. It's the World Bank a couple of years ago, and it's one of its World Development reports has a discussion of what's called labor market flexibility. Again, if you've had economics courses, you know that this is a really important thing. Labor market flexibility means that, well, as the World Bank put it, they say it's gotten a bad name as a euphemism for pushing wages down and workers out. And the reason it's got that bad name is that's exactly what it is. It's a device for pushing wages down and workers out. But it's got this bad name. They say, nevertheless, the World Bank insists it is the absolutely essential part of what are called reforms. It's the most essential part of reforms. So every country has to maximize labor market flexibility. And also, and part of it, they continue, is to break the relation between labor contracts and social services. So in other words, break any relation between things like, contract for a job and maybe health care. You've got to break that, because that interferes with the perfect functioning of markets, which you only get if you have labor market flexibility. Labor market flexibility has the nice part, when they say, it increases labor mobility, and that doesn't mean allowing people to cross borders, say. Free trade theory, if it would to mean anything, would mean people are free to go anywhere. You read Adam Smith, free movement of people, free distribution of labor is the core of free market theory, but of course that's not part of globalization. Labor mobility means that the ability to kick workers out, to make work temporary and unsecured. Cost flexibility means down, lowering costs, like lowering wages, and a lot of techniques for that. And all of this contributes to something else which is highly desirable, namely what's called worker insecurity. Here you can turn to people like Alan Greenspan, the saintly Mr. Allen, as he's sometimes called, who testified before Congress a couple of years ago on why we have such a great economy. And he attributed a large part of it to what he called growing worker insecurity, which makes workers unwilling to ask to institute demands, for higher wages and better services and so on. And that's a good thing. Again, you can learn about that in any economics class. It keeps inflation down. It's good for bankers. Not great for people, but their interests are incidental in a well-functioning economy. Mexico, incidentally, is considered, despite what I just described, and that's only a piece of it, is considered a booming, successful economy, kind of an economic miracle. And in fact, the macroeconomic statistics look pretty good. It's just the people who aren't participating in it. They're getting smashed. That has to do with the latter part of the ditty, that brings rewards for all, at least for all who matter. In Mexico, it does bring rewards. It brings rewards for U.S. manufacturers, for their Mexican counterparts, for a sector of the Mexican wealthy. In fact, the number of billionaires in Mexico has gone up about as fast as the poverty rate. They sort of track each other. And that's a that's an economic miracle. You can read the lead article in the New Republic this week by a old lefty friend of ours, Paul Berman, who has just been back from Mexico and is just amazed by this fantastic economy. It may even be overheating. You've got to do something to slow it down. It's only working people and peasants who are getting it in the neck. But apart from that, the economy is great. I was talking about differences between a century ago and today. One difference is the constitution of trade has changed. So now it's a lot more manufacturing, and that has to do with the capacity in the contemporary period to distribute manufacturing. For say General Motors to send out the pieces of manufacturing to wherever you can make the most profit. Most profit means lowest wages, least environmental conditions, and so on and so forth, and also options for transfer pricing. So that's led to a lot of a sharp rise in trade and manufacturers. As I mentioned, this trade is an extremely misleading term for it. The figure of 65% now for Mexico is probably more or less accurate. That's higher than the world total. What's the world total of intra-firm, within a single firm, cross-border interaction? Well, in a way, nobody really knows. One of the reasons you don't know is you're dealing with totalitarian institutions, namely transnational corporations, and they don't tell you anything. Okay, like they tell you what they want to tell you. There is a way to get the answers. So, for example, Congress has subpoena power, and if it wants, it can open the books. One of the oldest requests of the labor movement in the United States was open the books. Let us find out what's going on inside these totalitarian institutions to which we rent ourselves, which is what a job is. Well, of course, that's the last thing that's going to happen. Congress will call for opening the books when Congress represents the population. Congress represents the corporations, it's not going to do it. They did do it once in the mid-70s. There's, in the wake of Watergate and the Vietnam War and a lot of popular, noises down from below. There was a multinational operation, MNMOC, I forget what it stands for, Multinational Operations Commission. What's it for? MNOC? Something like that. There was the Church Commission. Senator Church held hearings on. This was multinational oil corporations. That was one part of a big investigation of major corporations, and they found out a lot of stuff. In fact, most of what's known about the international energy system, oil industry, comes from the Church hearings. It's just a rich mine of data as to how this system works. But that was a one-shot thing. It hasn't happened again. The UN used to have an agency which monitored transnational corporations, but that was killed a couple of years ago, mainly by the United States, which doesn't want that information around. So when you look at texts on international economics and you ask and you look for what portion of trade is actually intra-firm within a single firm, what you get is guesses. People's guesses range on the neighborhood of 40% or so. So roughly 40% of world trade is guessed is internal to corporations. That's recognized to be what's called a stunning figure by Jeffrey Sachs, a well-known U.S. Harvard international economist. Whatever the figure is, it's 30%, 50%, something in that neighborhood. It's stunning, which means that when people talk about trade increasing, they're being extremely misleading. Trade may actually be declining in any meaningful sense of the word trade when you eliminate the fact that a lot of the so-called trade is centrally managed interactions within totalitarian institutions, not what any classical economist would have called trade. Furthermore, that's only a piece of it. There are other forms of managed interaction. One of them is called outsourcing. If a corporation, say GM, wants to minimize costs, meaning labor costs, benefits, and so on, one of the things they do is outsourcing. You get smaller companies that don't have any, that don't hire union wage labor and don't have conditions on them, get them to produce the parts, and that's often done overseas. Outsourcing adds another, but that's also centrally managed. That adds another big component. When you put those components together, you're probably running up to maybe 60 or 70% of what's called world trade. And that's not the whole story. There are what are called strategic alliances among big firms. So firms don't really want to compete. Why compete? It hurts everybody. So you have what's called a strategic alliance in which you work together. You jointly produce, you have common, get your parts together, you do common research and so on and so forth. Nobody knows the scale of this. Again, we're dealing with totalitarian institutions, but it's generally assumed to be large. In fact, some international economists talk about what they call alliance capitalism, meaning huge, monstrous corporations in strategic alliances with one another, oligopolies that control pieces of the market and, and telecommunications or banking or insurance or automobile production or whatever. That's the international economy. It's sometimes called corporate mercantilism. It's kind of mercantilism, but under control of big tyrannies. What the exact figures are, nobody knows, but it's generally assumed by the few people who look at it that a considerable majority, maybe on the order of 3/4 or something, of what's called world trade is actually centrally managed interaction. Well, that's a difference from a century ago. And it means that by a reasonable measure, if you really meant by trade what classical economists meant by trade, it may actually be declining, in fact, declining sharply, even though cross-border interactions are increasing. Well, that's a difference from a century ago. Another major difference has to do with the quantity of the scale of financial transfers. They are huge. I mean, since the period of globalization, about the last 30 years, speculative flows, cross-border financial flows have just exploded astronomically. They were, maybe speculative flows were something like 10% of the total money in international exchanges, foreign exchanges, about 30 years ago. It's now probably close to 98%, and a much bigger figure. It's just totally outweighs all of the capital in central banks and so on and so forth. And that means that approximately, something on the order of 98% of the capital in international exchanges is not used for productive purposes, either for production or commerce or whatever, but just speculating against currencies and things like that. That's totally new. There's been nothing like it in history. And it has lots of effects. One thing is it makes financial markets extremely volatile and unpredictable. They go all over the place and they're totally out of control. In fact, it's become so harmful to the economy that it's even harming rich people. And when things start to harm rich people, then you get calls for regulation. Like if only the South calls for regulation of financial markets, it's idle chatter. But when it really begins to harm the interests of people who matter, then something's done. So by now there's a lot of discussion. For example, the European Union has come out, and right now it's just the United States that's blocking it. The European Union's in favor, and so on, of some form of regulation of international financial markets. That would be something like what happened about a century ago. There was a period, same period around the late 19th century, when there were sort of markets functioning, something roughly like markets were functioning for a while. And it was a complete disaster. I mean, it led to huge economic crashes all over the place. Financial markets were totally out of control. Every country instituted, including the United States, instituted some form of regulation of markets, and in particular financial markets. The regulation of markets was done by corporations. That was the sort of the source of the modern corporation, was a way of administering markets within business itself, like corporations, trusts, cartels, and so on have that effect. Within financial markets, it was done by things like Federal Reserve, and comparable systems in other countries, which essentially impose regulation on financial markets. There's now talk, and it will presumably be implemented sooner or later, of some form. There are a lot of proposals for regulating international financial markets because it's just too harmful for the rich, and they don't want to tolerate it. Right now, it's really just the United States that's blocking it. Europe and Japan have come out in favor of it, and it will probably come through. So that's another change. The last change, and maybe the most important one from over a century ago, has to do with it really has to do with democracy, and it's rather well discussed in the technical literature, I should say. If you read, the major technical studies of the histories of the international economy, they discuss it pretty accurately. So one of the best, if you want to look it up, is a guy named Barry Eichengreen. He's a well-known international economist, has a history of the international economic system. And he points out that, like I just said, and as everybody points out, that by gross measures, today's globalization is not unlike a century ago, but the big difference that he focuses on has to do with what he calls politicization of decision-making over the economy. As it points out that a century ago, say around 1900, the financial macroeconomic socioeconomic policy within the rich countries was not yet politicized. The suffrage was very limited. Male suffrage only was very limited. There weren't any parliamentary labor parties. Unions were weak, and therefore it was possible to maintain what's called financial rectitude. That is, to keep currencies more or less stable, which bankers like, even though against market pressure, simply by imposing the costs on the population. So if you had to impose some huge cost on the population, say, depression or unemployment and so on, there's nothing the people could do about it. So that was good. Then you could maintain, stable currencies and still keep open financial markets. He says, well, that changed in the early part of the 20th century and later. Male suffrage increased. Some countries, general suffrage increased. Parliamentary labor parties developed in some places. Labor unions got more active, and financial decision making was politicized. So therefore, there had to be something new. And what happened in 1945, what's called the Bretton Woods system, formed by the United States and Britain at the time, mainly the U.S., Keynes and Harry Dexter White, he says, replaced limitations on democracy by limitations on capital flow. So the Bretton Woods system in 1945 instituted limitations on capital flow, which insulated countries from market pressures because capital couldn't flow in and out freely, and that overcame the limitations of democracy, which were from the earlier period. Well, this led to the next phase of the next big phase of globalization, international integration from roughly 1945 until around 1970, which was a period of historic. It was a period where the regime was, the basic regime was control of capital flow. So stabilization of currencies, like all currencies, were kept pretty stable, linked to the U.S. dollar, which was linked to gold, and the capital flow was restricted. Countries had the right to limit capital flow to insulate them from market pressures. That allowed several things to happen. One thing was it was a period of unprecedented economic growth, way beyond the modern period, in fact, without historical precedent all over the world. Sharp increase in trade, in fact, more than in the latest period of globalization. And also the possibility of carrying out social democratic policies. Countries where economic planning, social and economic planning, was insulated from market pressures. You didn't have to worry about the virtual Senate because of the restrictions on capital flow. They were able to introduce what we call welfare states. So this is the period of welfare state capitalism with very high growth rates and so on. That's the period which a lot of economists call the golden age of capitalism, roughly 1950 to 1970, roughly that period. Well, that changed in the early 70s. That's where Eichengreen's story ends. Replaced limitations on democracy with limitations on capital flow. Actually, the rules of the IMF still include the right of countries to limit capital flow. They don't impose it, but it's there. In the early 70s, the Bretton Woods system was dismantled for various reasons, primarily by U.S. and Canadian and British initiative and a couple other rich countries. Finally, that whole system was dismantled. That's when you introduce the period of liberalization. That's the period that's now called globalization. Okay, it's this period, roughly the early 70s to the present, and it has the obvious consequences, an attack on democracy. You can't maintain financial rectitude if you have free capital flow unless you limit democracy, and that's the contemporary period. It's a period of increase of formal democracy, but sharp decrease of substantive democracy by essentially moving decision-making into the hands of the other constituency of the dual constituency conundrum, investors and lenders. They're the ones who make the decisions, so you may be able to elect officials if you like, but it doesn't matter that much. Well, what are the consequences of all of this? About what Keynes and White and other economists of the period would have expected. It's called a fairy tale economy, and there's a lot of talk about how marvelous the economy is, but that's all nonsense. Simply look at the figures, which are not in contention. There's nothing contentious about this. Since the early 70s, economic growth has cut back substantially. The U.S. had a very prestigious commission headed by Paul Volcker, former head of the Federal Reserve. You can't get more prestigious than that. A couple of years ago, which estimated that for the industrial countries, since the onset of liberalization, what's called globalization, for the industrial countries, they estimated that economic growth had cut back by about 50%. Maybe that's a little high. Others estimate by about a third. UNCTAD, in its latest report, Trade and Development Report last year, estimated that for the so-called developing countries, it's, again, economic growth is cut back by about half. Well, there is one exception. This is overall. During this period, there has been one moment of growth, the Asia-Pacific countries, the East Asian countries. It's mostly South Korea and Taiwan, a couple others. Others are more flimsy, but mostly South Korea and Taiwan, to some extent Thailand. Those are countries that simply refused to, or were able to block, to keep away from the regime of financial liberalization. They did not undergo it. They, like South Korea, actually had the death penalty for capital flight in the 1980s. Literally, I don't know if they exercised it. It was on the books. So they, in countries like South Korea and Taiwan and Thailand, the government was powerful enough not only to control labor, but also to control capital, which is unusual. And they had there were other advantages that they had that were allowed them for sort of international strategic reasons, like access to the U.S. market, even when they protected their internal markets and carried out state-coordinated industrialization. The chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, before he was appointed chief economist 3 or 4 years ago, had an article in the World Bank Research Observer, their main research journal, in which he talked about the East Asian miracle, the economic miracle. And he said that what these countries, what succeeded for them is, he said, that they did not follow the religion, his word, they did not follow the religion that markets know best. And in fact, carried out state-coordinated industrial development, which it did indeed lead to high levels of growth, very high levels. That terminated in the early 90s when they were compelled, not Taiwan restricted it, but South Korea at least was essentially compelled by the United States to open its financial markets. And they were liberalized, and within a couple of years there was a crash. What will happen after that? Nobody knows. Actually, nobody knows anything, I should say. The thing, international finance, you read serious economists, and they tell you, look, we haven't a clue what's going on, because there is no economic theory of financial markets. It's all haze. And that's a huge part of the international economy. Again, the same Jeffrey Sachs recently pointed out. He said that the international economy, he said, is dimly understood. The Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central bankers, again, like super conservative. After the latest series of crashes, they said, look, we have to recognize that we have to face the international economy with humility, because we don't know what the hell's going on. And there are models in which various things happen, but they have extremely little relation to the world. In fact, the record of prediction over the years is just abysmal. I mean, if this happened in any science, like, say, chemistry or something, they'd eliminate it from all the universities. The predictions are wildly off in case after case. And it's not a criticism of economics. It's just too hard. It's too hard to figure out what's going on in such complex systems. So basically, nobody knows what's going to happen next. But what has happened, at least we do know, what has happened is that the total growth rate has cut back sharply, maybe by somewhere between a third and a half for the industrial countries, by roughly a half for all of the developing countries. There was one piece of that picture, East Asia, which for a while had very rapid growth rates, then collapsed, and we don't know what's going on next. For, say, Latin America, and furthermore, the countries that have been more subjected to the neoliberal programs, to the right recipes, are the worst off. So Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the former Soviet Union, and 90s East Asia, most of it, not Taiwan, they're the ones where the programs have most been employed, and those are the ones that are worst off by far. Latin America, for example, which is potentially quite rich, should be a flourishing area. Well, the World Bank recently reported that, quoting it, they said, despite, the word is important, despite more than 2 decades of economic reforms, they're no better off than they were back in the mid-70s. The word despite begs a few questions, maybe because of 2 decades of, anyhow, whatever. That's the relationship. Put in whatever word you like there. They say despite. And that's the picture. The East, the so-called transition economies, the former Soviet Union, which were subjected immediately to Big Bang liberalization. All the economic models, there was unanimity in this, said this is going to be a tremendous success. They'll move to free market capitalism, everything will take off, all the models prove it, and so on. It was a total disaster. I mean, millions of people died. The economies collapsed by about 50%. This same Joseph Stiglitz, World Bank chief economist, had an article in an economics journal about a year ago about this called "Who Will Guard the Guardians?" In which he pointed out that all of the recommendations led to a complete disaster, contrary to all predictions. He says, we got to at least be honest enough to rethink our principles and our models if this is what happens when you apply them. He's been since kicked out as chief economist of the World Bank. He's a very distinguished economist. Well, economic growth slowed, and the same is true of other major measures. So productivity slowed, capital investment slowed down, interest rates are much higher than they were in the golden age. Raising interest rates slows down growth. Market volatility is much higher, crashes all over the place. In fact, by just about every measure, things have gotten worse. So why is it called a fairy tale economy? Well, for a sector of the population, they've gotten way better. Like people in my income bracket are making out like bandits. The top few percent of the population are doing fine. Actually, it's a very small, here we're back to the ditty again, all who matter. So take, say, the United States, the richest country in the world, which has been subjected to these policies more or less since about the late 70s. Carter actually initiated them, and then it continues, something like structural adjustment. Well, in the United States, wages have just about, after a long economic growth, it's called a great boom, but it isn't by historical standards. It's by no means great, but it's long. After a roughly 7 or 8 year economic period of economic growth, wages are more or less back to what they were, where they were in 1989, much lower than they were in the 1970s. That's, again, I think unprecedented in American economic history, such a long period in which wages have either stagnated or declined. Also, it's differentiated. In the age group where there are families, like that's where the family, 55 year and under is what they call it, in that age sector, net worth, that means assets minus debt, that has actually declined across the board for families, basically. Now there's college-educated families, where the head of the family, what they call the head of the family, the working member of the family is college-educated. For that sector, there's been an increase in wages, but not for anyone else. That means around 80% of the population have been left out of even growth of wages. They've been able to maintain incomes, but only by working a lot harder. So 2 members of the family are now forced to work. If they choose to work, fine, but they're forced to work. Furthermore, the workload per person has increased by about a month since 1989. That's now the highest in the industrial world, just past Japan about a year or 2 ago. So the general picture for the United States is, for the large majority of the population, at best they've stagnated, maybe declined over the period of liberalization, while the workload is much heavier. There's a sector, however, which has gained a lot. Growth hasn't been all that great. It's been slower than in the golden age, but there's been some. and it's highly concentrated. And they're the guys who write the articles, and they're the ones who meet their friends at the elegant restaurants. And then what they see is a fairy tale, undoubtedly. They just don't see what's happening choose not to see what's happening to the majority of the population, and they choose not to look at the statistics that are right in front of their eyes. Now, that's only a piece of the story. There's much worse to come if you look closely. Most of the economic measures are highly ideological. I mean, they're called objective, but they're selected to reflect some things and not others. It's true of gross domestic product and everything else. But there are efforts to give measures of the things that matter for human life, what are called social statistics, like things like hunger and illiteracy and average wages and child abuse and that kind of stuff. In every country except the United States, every industrial country except the United States, those figures are presented by the government. So the government presents every year a record of social statistics, meaning that substantial resources go into collecting that information, and you get some kind of number. The United States did have one once. It was in 1928. Herbert Hoover had a big study of social statistics, but that's the last one. However, there are private institutions that do it. The main one is Fordham University. It's a Jesuit university in New York, which has an institute that tries to do an analysis of social statistics. They point out that the data is pretty poor because they don't have the resources of the government. And for most of these things, like, say, hunger, there isn't any really reliable data. But they've been compiling it for years. Their latest volume just came out of 1999, so it carries through maybe to 1998. And they have very interesting findings. Right through the golden age, up till, say, the mid-'70s, social indicators, social statistics, track GDP. Okay, so as the economy goes up, you get the same kind of very close, following that very closely, you get general social conditions improving, like all the kinds of things I mentioned. Around the mid-'70s, the two curves begin to separate. So GDP keeps going up, not as fast as before, but it keeps going up. On the other hand, social indicators start to decline. And in fact, they're now at the level below the time when they started, below 1960. It's what they call a social recession, deep social recession. And those are the main conditions of life. It's getting, I don't want to go on too long, but similar things are happening in other countries. Like you take a look at India, it's about the same. Mexico, it's about the same, and so on. Well, that's the fairy tale economy, and that's globalization. When you look, there are lots of other aspects of this to look at, and they're important. And here, I should say, the protesters, people who are protesting all this stuff, should be cautious in checking their facts, because they're not always accurate. Sometimes the facts are worse than what the protesters are protesting, and that's worth knowing, too. So just to give you one example, at the Seattle and Washington demonstrations, you remember a lot of people were dressed up as turtles, okay, because they were protesting a World Trade Organization ruling, this had to do with complaints by a number of countries against the U.S. Endangered Species Act, which the U.S. had imposed rules on shrimp fishing, or whatever it's called, to ensure that they wouldn't capture sea turtles, which are an endangered species. And countries brought that to the World Trade Organization, and they had a ruling which the general understanding, which is incorrect, is that the World Trade Organization ruled against the turtles, against the Endangered Species Act, saying that trade trumps preservation of endangered species. Actually, that's not what happened. What happened is more interesting. The World Trade Organization agreed that protection of endangered species overrules trade restrictions. Nevertheless, they ruled against the United States, but on grounds of its unilateralism. They said the United States is insisting that its specific form of protecting turtles must be adopted by everyone. They say other countries have other approaches to it, and the way this has to be resolved is by negotiation. But the U.S. doesn't negotiate. It issues rules, and that's what the World Trade Organization ruled against. It said, yeah, the principle's fine, but you have to do it in a way that meets reasonable procedures. You know, listen to what other countries have to say, and maybe it's better than what you have to say, and then try to work it out.
Chomsky, right along that line, isn't there problems with the World Trade Organization and certain issues with American companies that are basically setting up businesses or corporations in other countries in order to get tax relief?
Actually, the World Trade Organization ruled against that. They've ruled against a version of that. One of the ways in which the U.S. corporations transfer taxes to the rest of the population is by setting up fake offices in places like, you know, the Cayman Islands and things like that. The European Union brought a case against that, claiming that's really a trade subsidy, and the World Trade Organization ruled against it. I mean, whether anything will happen, who knows? I mean, look, I'm not saying the World Trade Organization is a great outfit. I think it ought to go to the flames, but not for these reasons. We have to have the right reasons. You know? Sometimes the cases actually are, you know, the actual facts are even more significant and harsher than what people are protesting about, like in this case. There are cases which are really bad. And this is a contentious issue. I mean, it could go either way. In the World Trade Organization, there is a rule. It came from GATT. You know, World Trade Organization picks up the GATT rules and extends them. There's an article of GATT, Article 20, which says that public goods, that means things like health and the environment and so on, can override trade rules. Okay, like if something is instituted to protect public health, that's permitted even if it interferes with some trade rule. There's come up in two cases. One of them is the turtles case, which I mentioned. The other one is a more striking one. It's cigarettes. Thailand had a state monopoly on cigarettes, trying to cut back cigarette smoking. Okay, and they claim they can't cut it back entirely because if they do, people will move to lethal narcotics. So they want to, you know, like opium, that kind of stuff. So they want to slowly cut back cigarette smoking, which is incidentally the most lethal. Cigarettes are the most lethal substance in world trade by a huge margin. Just to take the United States, last year there were 400,000 tobacco-related deaths, 16,000 deaths related to all hard drugs, you know, combined, all drugs combined outside of tobacco. It's just orders of magnitude worse. The U.S. export of tobaccos has increased very rapidly. That's one of the great triumphs of the so-called free trade era. Since 1975, U.S. export of cigarettes has increased by about a factor of 5, you know, 5 times as much as it was, which is a huge increase in trade thanks to what's called free trade. Of course, this leads to, you know, just millions of deaths. I mean, incalculable millions of deaths follow from this. Countries are forced to accept this. If a country tries to restrict import of U.S. cigarettes, they're threatened with trade sanctions, severe trade sanctions, which you can't overlook if the market is the United States. In fact, they even have to accept advertising. You know, advertising aimed at vulnerable populations like women and children. If they don't, it's a violation of free trade and free speech, which we uphold with great force. On the other hand, let's say the Colombian cartels are not permitted to have ads on television aimed at children telling them how great cocaine is. You know, they're not permitted to do that. It only works in one direction, like a lot of these things. Thailand in 1989, about 10 years ago, the United States brought a charge against Thailand in what was then GATT, it's now the World Trade Organization, to try to force Thailand to drop restrictions on import of U.S. cigarettes. And Thailand, various technical grounds, but the main argument that they produced was Article 20. They said we have a right on grounds of public health to interfere with the trade in what amounts to lethal, very lethal substances, cigarettes. And that went to a World Trade Organization, a GATT panel, and it had a ruling in which they held that health considerations can overrule trade, but then they introduced a notion, which comes from economists again, that it has to be done by the least trade restrictive measure, meaning if any neoclassical economist can figure out a way in which in some hypothetical non-existent universe where you don't care about costs, there's another way of achieving this result, then you're not allowed to do it by blocking import. Okay, that's essentially what it says in lay language. Well, that kind of nullifies Article 20. And if that stands, then countries won't have the option of limiting import of lethal substances, like cigarettes. It's like, why are the tobacco companies turning to export? The reason is because smoking during this period was declining in the United States. In fact, it was declining in an interesting way. It was becoming class-related. When a use of substances becomes class-related, it typically gets criminalized. That's the long history of this. Prohibition was like this. In the 1980s, among more educated sectors, smoking declined. It was part of a lifestyle change, like everything declined. The use of red meat, alcohol. I mean, across the board, lots of substance use declined, including cigarettes, including, incidentally, marijuana. So the peak use of marijuana in the United States was around 1979, but that was a low point for criminalization. The reason was folks like you, children of rich parents, and you don't send them to jail. In fact, you can't because they'll prevent it in various ways. So use was very high, criminalization was very low. In the 1980s, the use of all these substances, including tobacco, declined, and criminalization went way up. Didn't happen. It sort of happened even for tobacco. The way it happens there is big liability, indemnity suits in courts and so on. The cigarette companies, and now, the prisons are overflowing with drug-related so-called crimes, mostly victimless, because the people you're going after are poor. So that's okay. You can toss them in jail. In fact, it's a good idea. About 10 or 15 years ago, it was predicted by, the guys who write the legal history of prohibition and so on. It was predicted that cigarette smoking will become illegal in the United States because it's class-related, pretty much class-related. And that's what's been happening. So the companies are getting huge lawsuits, and Philip Morris has ads all over the place telling you how the Philip Morris people are helping distribute food to starving people and children and so on and so forth. And in order to compensate for this, the cigarette companies, which could see it coming, I mean, they read the statistics, started exporting cigarettes to mostly to the third world. And there's where it becomes extremely important to use the weapon of free trade to ram those doors open so we can send our lethal substances to them and make a profit from it. Same thing happened with, for example, lead. Lead was known to be toxic back in 1920, but it was kept in gasoline simply by legal shenanigans and paying off politicians and stuff for around 50 years. Finally, it was made illegal in the United States, and the lead exports went way up to the third world, so they still use tetraethyl lead in gasoline and so on. Same thing's happening with cigarettes. Well, these are some of the outcomes of actual trade. Cigarette transactions really are trade. I mean, unlike what happens in the automobile industry. And it's going up real fast, and the welfare outcomes you can see. I mean, let me just end with this. There's a ton more to talk about. But, freedom of movement of capital and what's called trade, misleadingly, have become sort of theological doctrines, as if they're goods in them, they're values in themselves. They're like values that must be preserved. But these things aren't values. I mean, there's nothing good or bad about trade. I mean, whether trade is good or bad depends on its outcomes. Like if the trade happens to be trade in cigarettes, it's horrible. It's like trade in the capacity to kill people, millions of people in this case. If the trade helps people, which it often does, then it's fine. But trade is no value, quite apart from the fact that most of what goes on isn't trade. As for mobility of capital, that's been definitely harmful. It's, as I said, it's had major effects on the economy, most of which have been harmful. Now, is there a chance for a new international economic order? Well, sure, why not? These are not laws of nature, they're not laws of history. I mean, what's the sort of line is there's no alternative. It's kind of a parody of Marx's iron laws of history. It just has to happen. You're kind of like a tidal wave. You can't stop it. And that's total nonsense. These are, you trace them back, it's human decisions, decisions of the powerful states made with particular interests in mind. There are alternative decisions that can be made all along the way. These questions are all up for grabs. Nobody should be misled by the idea that there is a thing, globalization, which somehow is inevitable. There's various kinds of international integration. They've taken different forms over the years. They can take different forms tomorrow. They're maybe good, maybe bad. You can measure that in terms of their outcomes, and it's up. In principle, there's no reason whatsoever why populations can't make these decisions. Okay. That's my half hour. Sorry, I talked so long. I should have told you to interrupt me. Yeah.
Just, you mentioned how in developed countries or even in Mexico, how, or the golden, as we call this, age of growth. Or in Mexico, you said how the economy, the macroeconomic numbers are growing, but
not as the way they were before. So here's another standard lie that's told. There's a thing called ISI, import substitution industrialization. It means countries try to protect their own industries and have internal industrial production substituting their own production for imports. Now economists will tell you that's inefficient, and by some measure it's inefficient. Every industrialized country got that way by you doing this. If the U.S. hadn't done this, we'd be exporting fur, which was our comparative advantage in 1820 or something. But because the U.S. set up very high tariffs to block British textiles, and later extremely high tariffs to block better British steel, and so on, it was possible to develop domestic industry. Well, ISI was the policy that was followed by most of the Third World up until around 1980, when they had to stop it under the threat of the concocted debt trap. If you look, it's claimed that that was inefficient. And in an abstract model of the world, it is inefficient. In the actual world, it was highly effective. So Mexican growth rates, to take Mexico, were much higher during the ISI period than they've been in the liberalization period.
In regards to, let's say, Canada and the U.S., like when Peter Jennings, or in Canada, Lloyd Robertson go on the nightly newscast and say, last year's economy grew by 3%.
Whose economy?
Like Canada and whatever, we're all supposed to jump up and cheer, but
except,
I'm wondering if even...
Look, in the 1950s, it was running at 5 and 6%. That's the 50% decline that they're talking about.
I'm wondering if even that so-called 3% increase in GDP that year is artificial in itself, because like the privatization, like vertically of society in terms of privatizing healthcare, telecommunications, education, water treatment, prisons, power plants, like were those things before they were privatized at such a large scale, were they factored into the GDP, or now are they
probably
artificially injected?
No, they should have. I mean, if people were counting right, they should have been figured. GDP, remember, it's a measure of something, but it's an ideological measure. I mean, there are a lot of ways to increase GDP. For example, my wife was driving last night and hit a pothole and wrecked a wheel in a car. Okay, that increases GDP because she's got to go to the garage and get them to fix the tire and maybe buy a new wheel and pay the mechanic and pay somebody to build them. So that increases GDP quite a lot. In fact, there was actually a study by the Department of Transportation trying to compare the cost of fixing the roads with the cost to people of not fixing the roads. And it turned out the cost of not fixing the roads was, I forget the number, but like roughly 1.5 times as high as fixing the roads. On the other hand, fixing the roads harms the economy because that's public expenses. whereas transferring the cost to individuals helps the economy because that increases GDP. These are not jokes. I mean, that's the way the thing works across the board. So like pollution increases GDP. For one thing, because then it costs a lot of money to get rid of the consequences. And also people get sick. And when they get sick, they go to doctors, and you pay the doctors, and you have to build a hospital, and so on and so forth. All of that increases GDP. I mean, GDP is something, but, it's not wholly. It's an ideological measure. You can think of different measures, which, like social indicators, say, which will give you a different picture of what's happening. But these numbers should have been counted in GDP if it was done right.
And how did the U.S. compel South Korea to open up its financial market?
Look, when the biggest thug on the block tells you to do something, you do it. For example, if the U.S. were to put some constraint on South Korean exports to the United States, the country would go down to 2. The actual method that was used was South Korea wanted to join the OECD, the rich men's club, the rich country. And the condition that the U.S. imposed was they can do it if they liberalized financial markets. Liberalizing financial markets, what it means in the real world is the U.S. takes over the economy, running the economy, because the U.S., what they call services, like banks and insurance companies and all that stuff, so totally overwhelms the rest of the world that if the markets are opened up, they take it over. That's what's going to happen in China, probably. In fact, that's one of the reasons the U.S. is so much in favor of the latest agreement. It's going to, if the Chinese allow it, if they follow the rules, it will allow U.S. financial institutions to essentially take over planning the Chinese economy. And what happened in South Korea is when they opened markets, it led to a tremendous amount of unconstrained capital flowing in, way more than they could absorb, and then it all sort of flowed out suddenly and get a crash. Taiwan didn't liberalize markets, and it didn't have a crash. In fact, the countries that did not suffer the Asian collapse much were China, Taiwan, and India, all three of which had refrained from opening up financial markets. Again, like I said before, nobody really understands what's going on anywhere, but that's at least some evidence suggesting that opening up the markets was a big factor in the crash, which I think most economists believe. Some true believers don't accept it. But actually, there's a real good book on this, incidentally. Robin Hannell has a short, readable, terrific South End book, it may be over there, called Panic Rules, which goes through a lot of this stuff in very readable and, fashion and very expertly. So, yeah.
Can you comment on the somewhat recent events in Ecuador, maybe its presentation to the press? From what I saw, Ecuador defaulted on its loans. In the press, I didn't see really incorporation of that history. And maybe what, if you know.
Ecuador has been following neoliberal policies. It had a collapse. There was an indigenous revolt, which essentially forced the new government in. Under what amounted to a fraud, the military managed to take over and return something like the old government. Big defeat for the indigenous movements. The indigenous population is huge in Ecuador, which had driven the thing through. The reasons for the revolt were the usual ones. I gave some statistics for the United States, but in the third world it's the same, except much worse. Like if the proportion of the population that suffers is much greater, and the suffering is much greater. So like if incomes stagnate in the United States, well, not a human tragedy. If they stagnate or decline in a place like Ecuador, it's a real human tragedy. You need water to drink, and that sort of thing. Ecuador is now, I suppose, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. It's a country with a lot of resources, like it has oil, for instance. But it's part of this Andean system, all of which is in turmoil. All of it. Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, that whole region is in great turmoil. And what's happening now is that the U.S. looks as though it's gearing up for a big counterinsurgency campaign, and maybe worse, in that whole region. The Ecuadorian army, for what it's worth, is releasing sort of press leaks claim the U.S. is building a big military base in Ecuador, a place called Manta, and they're claiming, I don't know if it's true or not, that what the U.S. is planning is a kind of Kosovo-style war to try to, heavy bombing, that kind of thing, to try to crush the growth of guerrilla forces and others that are growing out of the socioeconomic inequities and oppression there. I mean, all this stuff has nothing to do with drugs, it's transparent, but drugs are kind of cover the way the Cold War used to be. And that's possible. I mean, so there may be plenty of trouble there. There's a base in Manta, there's a base in El Salvador, a new base going up, and there are a couple of others, and they don't tell us what they're for, but probably for planned military action. Colombia now has moved to first place in the world in the receipt of American arms. That's aside from Israel and Egypt, a separate category, but it replaced Turkey in 1999, and it's going up again next year. And you usually learn a lot by watching the flow of arms, and it tells you where the atrocities are going to happen. And Ecuador is part of this. In Bolivia, for example, another country subjected to all of this, it was under martial law a couple of weeks ago. There was a big peasant uprising in Cochabamba, one large town in Bolivia, because following World Bank instruction, the government's been privatizing everything, following World Bank instructions. And those instructions require that people pay what are called user costs. Like you have to pay the actual cost of water, say. It can't be provided as a public good to people, like in any civilized society. But if you want to follow World Bank rules, health and water and all that kind of stuff have to have user costs. So they privatized the water company. That was sold to probably more or less given. There's claims that it was total corruption, which it probably was. Anyhow, it was transferred over to a Bechtel-based conglomerate. Bechtel's a San Francisco, London-based big conglomerate. And there were months of protest over this, and they finally ended up so extensive that the government had to declare martial law. And in fact, an interesting case, this happened right during the Washington protests. And the interaction between them turned out to be kind of important, maybe one of the most important things in the Washington protests. The focus on the IMF and World Bank, combined with the protests in Bolivia, allowed an international network of protests to develop, mostly through the internet, which was enough so that Bechtel backed out, and the Bolivian government backed off the privatization, at least for the time being. I'm sure they'll come back. In the background of this also happens to be coca eradication. Right at the same time, there's a big agricultural crisis in Bolivia, just like all through the Andes. Peasants have been forced to coca production, and now the coca is being destroyed, by chemical and biological warfare. And there's a huge protest of peasants around La Paz, the capital, about the same time, over the destruction of coca. I mean, they don't want to grow coca particularly. They're calling for alternative crops, support for alternative crop production. And the U.S. doesn't want to do that. I mean, we're perfectly happy to destroy, but not build. The Colombia plan, for example, includes nothing. The guerrillas in Colombia for years have been calling for some funding for development, for creation of alternative crops, so the peasants aren't forced to grow poppy and coca to survive. And absolutely nothing. The new Colombia plan has, so far the United States altogether has provided $750,000 all told for alternative crops, which is nothing, and zero for the guerrilla-controlled areas, which are the ones that are under attack.
A couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, you gave a kind of sector called Power to the People, where you addressed the role that activists played in shutting down the MAI talks. And I was just wondering if you could maybe address some of those strategies again for those of us who are, engaged in those.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have anything smart to say about strategies, just the usual things. But for example, this Bolivia case is a perfectly clear case. I mean, here's just right a couple of weeks ago, thanks to the protests in Washington, which sort of focused global attention on the World Bank and the IMF, Bolivian peasants and some activists, there's some Western, North American activists there who can handle the internet and that sort of thing, which most Bolivian peasants can't, were able to organize international protests, amplified greatly by what was going on in Washington. And they were significant, like, New Zealand, for example. There were big protests at the Bolivian embassy, and police had to be called to protect the embassy and that sort of thing. Well, the effect of that was, at least temporarily, to save the water system for poor people. It doesn't, like power doesn't stop. They're going to try again. But that turned out to be an unanticipated beneficial consequence of the Washington protests. And these things tend to feed on each other. I think the word is synergy or something like that. They interact in ways which help each other. And I don't think there's any particular right tactic. I mean, whatever seems appropriate at the moment and where you are and so on. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could touch on what's now being lauded as the end game in the Middle East peace process.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting notion. The term peace process is another term of art. What the peace process refers to, what the term peace process refers to, is to the U.S. effort to prevent peace. That's literally true. I mean, for the last 30 years, the United States has been almost completely isolated in the world in trying to prevent the diplomatic settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Actually, this was from 1971 up till 1991. Every year, there was a vote at the United Nations General Assembly for a settlement of the conflict in terms of a very broad international consensus. Israeli withdrawal from the conquered territories and the Palestinian state in the liberated areas. That's been an international consensus for since certainly the mid-70s, and it's just about everybody. The U.S. has blocked it at every turn. It vetoed it at the Security Council a couple of times. The votes at the General Assembly are like 150 to 2 and that sort of thing, year after year after year, because the U.S. simply does not. It's alone and not calling for Israeli withdrawal and not recognizing Palestinian rights. Well, that changed in 1991, and it changed for a very simple reason: the Gulf War. The U.S. One of the main purposes of the Gulf War was, George Bush put it rather simply. He said, "What we say goes," okay, especially in the Middle East, and we're going to show that by force. And the world got the message. Everybody backed off. The U.S. then instituted its own extreme rejectionist program at Madrid and then Oslo and then since. The program that's been instituted does not require Israel. It requires partial Israeli withdrawal as Israel and the United States decide. So that's in violation of the major diplomatic agreements like UN 242 and others. And it's set up in such a way, thanks to folks like us, we pay the taxes and we pay for the Israeli development. It's set up, if you look at the map, in such a way that the Palestinian areas will be separated cantons, kind of unviable separated cantons. So in the Gaza Strip, there are several of them split by Israeli settlements, and same in the West Bank. So the major development in the West Bank is what's called Greater Jerusalem. But Greater Jerusalem, if you look at the map, extends to a couple of miles from Jericho. And since Israel's taken over the Jordan Valley, that essentially splits the West Bank into two. And there's a couple other splits. It's a kind of it's a Bantustan settlement. It's very similar to the homelands that were established in South Africa in the early 60s. In some ways worse, because South Africa was trying to get some international legitimacy. So therefore it subsidized the homelands, tried to make them look like, it called them states. They were run by black leaders. And they wanted to make them look kind of legitimate, so there was some subsidy. Israel doesn't have to worry about international legitimacy. It's got the United States behind it. So therefore it doesn't have to subsidize. In fact, it doesn't have to do anything. And when I say Israel, it means the United States, because that's the source of their funding and power and everything else. So that's the peace process. The peace process is something comparable roughly to South African Bantustans back in the early 60s, imposed by force because since the Gulf War, because the U.S. was able to ram through an extreme rejectionist program. One of the most dramatic examples of U.S. power in the modern period that I know of is that most of the world has accepted this. Not only has Europe accepted it, but even the third world, like say in India, they think that this is a peace process. I mean, I remember I was there a couple of years ago and talking to people about it and saying, look, you know, you yourselves were strongly opposing this a couple of years ago. How can you call this a peace process? And they'd sort of forgotten. They kind of remembered when you brought it to their attention. But what the U.S. imposes is so overwhelmingly powerful that most of the world accepts it, even if they'd rejected it. That's real power, you know, kind of measured in the ideological level. You just insist on your own policy. You got enough force to ram it through. When you get it through, everybody accepts this as right and just. And the end game is just, you know, finishing it up.
Rather for the trade bill with China,
yeah.
There was some clause that was added that would ensure monitors should be able to go into China and look at the factors of the conditions. And China said, well, we've never let this happen before, we're not going to let it happen. What do you think about it?
It doesn't make any difference. I mean, NAFTA also has, I mean, in order to get NAFTA through, they had to put in provisions that, you know, guaranteed labor monitoring of labor rights and that sort of thing. But you know, takes power behind. Why should they? I mean, they will. You know, they would if there was popular pressure behind it. The popular pressure would include Chinese workers. You know, like they don't want to work in factories that are going to burn down and people die either. So yes, if there was joint action by the population of China and the population of the United States to improve working conditions, sure. In fact, that's exactly has been the position of, say, U.S. labor. It's continually denounced for being protectionist, this, that, and the other thing, but that's not been its position. Its position has been to call for compensatory funding or other devices to improve conditions in the third world countries so that when they enter into trade relations with us, workers in the rich countries don't suffer. In fact, the model that they often use is the European Union. You know, it's not all that utopian. Before the European Union integrated its own South, you know, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, the third world parts essentially of the European Union. Before they did that, they did a lot of funding, called compensatory funding, it's called, to sort of raise their levels and their working standards and so on to something within range of Northern European workers, so that then when the borders were freed up, it didn't mean that everybody had a race to the bottom. I mean, there's nothing, I mean, these are really mild reformist programs, certainly within range. And that's been essentially the position of the labor movement. But the corporations, of course, don't want it. They want the rotten conditions. So what the U.S. government will do depends on internal struggles for power inside the United States. And of course, in China, it's a difficult situation. The government in China doesn't represent the population of China at all. I mean, the government of the United States, at least to some limited extent, is constrained by the population, but not in China. So here's another point that Robin Hanel has pointed out very well in an article in Z a couple of months ago and in other things. The real issue, I think he's right about this, in the China deal is what happens to the people of China. Now, it doesn't affect people in the United States that much to some extent, but it has a big effect on people in China, and they don't have any voice. I mean, they're not represented by their government. They're certainly not represented by our government. But that's the primary issue. And it's an issue that requires cross-border solidarity, which is not easy to work out, but not impossible either.
I don't know if you can consider this a strategy question, but I was wondering what you think of what Ralph Nader's been doing so far this year, and what the coverage of that has been like, and even if you'd rather not take a position on that.
No, I think perfectly happy to. I just don't take positions with any confidence. I'm happy to take positions at a very low confidence level.
Position on globalization is roughly similar to yours.
Yeah.
If there's anything you critique of him, or if you just think the whole idea of a progressive presidential candidate is inherently ludicrous.
Well, I mean, I'm one of the I signed something or other that makes me an official supporter of the Nader campaign. Yeah, I think as long as he puts issues seriously on the agenda, yeah, that's good. I mean, I don't agree with him about everything, why should two people agree on everything? But these are, a lot of room for discussion here. So, for example, I'm much more anti-corporate than he is, and I think the whole system is wrong in ways that he doesn't. But on the issues that he's discussing, I think by and large, I think he's right. And if those issues can be put on the agenda of discussion, if they can become visible through a political campaign, it's okay. I mean, I don't know if it makes much difference. When it comes to the question of voting or not voting, which is another choice, it's a very delicate decision. I mean, it's also kind of a decision of 10th order importance, I think. It doesn't really matter all that much. What matters is helping create a climate of opinion in which people are willing to do things, that matter a lot more than voting for a candidate. But I think, by and large, the candidacy has been constructive. The media coverage is what you'd expect and kind of plays it down.
No, I was wondering if you could speak on the implications of the Star Wars missile defense hysteria as a component of the rogue state mentality.
That's kind of interesting, and here I think it's not. I mean, the effect of the national missile defense, the new Star Wars, I think there's pretty broad agreement among strategic analysts here and elsewhere. Surprisingly broad agreement, namely that it's very likely to increase the danger of nuclear war and nuclear proliferation, because everyone, Russia, China, everyone else, regards it as a first strike weapon, and correctly. Like if any other country was doing it, we'd regard it as a first strike weapon. In fact, the U.S. has tried to placate Russia by amazingly urging them to put their missiles on launch on warning status, because that says, well, okay, that way you don't have to worry about it. But that's just like total insanity. I mean, see, our missiles are on launch on warning status, and that's bad enough, because that means anything accidental can cause a war. But in the case of Russia, a kind of collapsing economy where the computers don't work and this and that, to have launch on warning status is like insanity. But that's the idea. And now, what's this for? That's an interesting question. And here, I think it's pretty hard to think of a rational answer. My feeling it's kind of like it's a very psychotic country in a lot of ways. It's not a joke. People are scared out of their wits of all sorts of things. Like, say, fear of crime in the United States is way beyond any other industrial country, although crime isn't. Crime's kind of like other countries. But fear of crime is out of sight. Fear of terrorism is much higher in the United States than in countries that really are much more subject to terrorism, which isn't much. And the same has been true with nuclear weapons. Like, I don't know, I have to do some arithmetic, but like when my kids were little, they, maybe you or some, people, they were taught in school to hide under desks. You notice that? To protect them from a nuclear attack. I mean, you don't even know what to say, but it's part of the same sense of fear. It's kind of like gated communities. People live in gated communities. Okay, when you do it in San Salvador, you can understand it. The richer control so much, that good reason to be scared. But, gated communities in the United States, or people have alarms in their cars. And I live in a suburb, middle class, professional middle class suburb. I mean, there's a police force, but I think the most it does is find lost parrots or something. I mean, nothing ever happens in place where. But there are alarms going off all the time. People have alarms in their houses. The cars all have alarms. Actually, our house, once there was a break-in at our house, and the police came, and they told us, look, yeah, we know who it is. It's local kids. They've got rich parents. We can't do anything about it. We know them, and they're not causing much harm. They're looking for drugs. And in fact, the only place they went to was the medicine cabinet, see if there was anything there. We asked afterwards, look, is there something we ought to do? So the cop who was there, he kind of laughed. He said, look, if you want, you can spend a lot of money and get an alarm system which will have lasers going all over the place, and it'll send an alarm to the police station in case any of those things go, but he says, you're just wasting your money. We don't pay any attention to any of those things. Because we know they're all false alarms. You know, there's nothing's ever going to happen in this town. But nevertheless, everybody has them. And of course, they go off randomly because all sorts of things. People forget to turn a key or whatever. Well, all of this is some kind of atmosphere of tremendous fear. And I have a feeling that the national missile defense is part of this. You know, there's just tremendous fear that they're out to get us. Now, why such fear? Well, you know, it may have to do with being the biggest thug on the block. I mean, in a sense that maybe somebody is going to try to get us, and maybe has reasons. But whatever the motives, I think they really have to be sought in this kind of sort of irrationality, which pervades the whole society. It's a very frightened society. It shows up in lots and lots of ways. I mean, for example, the belief that aliens are among us. I don't remember the last numbers, but it's extremely high in the United States, and almost, you know, nothing anywhere else. You know, you know, there are all kind of measures like this in which the United States is kind of off the chart, and it's worth thinking about. But I suspect it's, in a sense, a kind of cultural phenomenon more than a, you know, political or economic one in this case.
Except for the role of like weapons contractors.
Yeah, the weapons contractors like it, and high tech likes it. It's another way to put money into high tech. But you know, you can do it in less dangerous ways than that.
So I think you made some connections between structural justice programs in third world countries and situations in low-income neighborhoods. Is that just a symbolic connection?
No, it's a real connection. I mean, the United States, and in fact most of the industrial world, like Canada and so on, have been subjected to a kind of structural adjustment over the last 20, 25 years, same period. Meaning cut back in social spending, privatization, you know, opening of, there isn't much in the way of opening of borders because they're pretty open ones anyway. Freedom of financial flows. You know. I mean, these are all aspects of structural adjustment, and they've been applied in the United States since the late Carter years.
Under what name or what color?
It's the name of you know, economic freedom or some such thing. I mean, whatever it's called. You know. I mean, it's what people call neoliberalism. In the United States, that word isn't used. Everywhere else it's used. Here it's called a free market. It's not a free market. No. I mean, the United States is about as remote from a free market as you can imagine. Almost every dynamic component of the economy relies crucially on the state sector. We have a huge state sector of the economy. Almost everything comes out of it. Often it's under the cover of defense. But I mean, like Alan Greenspan gave a speech a couple of years ago to newspaper editors, which was kind of an interesting speech. He's, you know, big honcho and very respected economist. He was praising the American entrepreneurial spirit that leads to our free market economy and all its wonderful achievements. And then he listed examples. And the examples that he listed are textbook cases of state-produced technology. I mean, computers, internet, telecommunications, right down the list. Every one of them comes straight out of the state sector. Like where I work at MIT, everybody knows this, except maybe the economics department. I'm not sure. Because that's where it pays their salaries. You know, you can't fail to know it. I mean, MIT is part of the funnel by which the public takes the risk and costs of the development of advanced industry, and then if anything works, you hand it over to the private sector. The one example he mentioned that isn't obviously like this is transistors, which is an interesting case. That's the one case that doesn't come straight out of the state sector. But transistors themselves are interesting. Transistors were produced in a private lab, invented in a private lab, Bell Labs. But that was during a period when AT&T had a monopoly. So that means it's a tax on the public. You know, if you're a monopoly, you can tax the public for whatever you feel like doing. So they taxed the public to set up a really great research center. You know, I used to go there all the time. The research center ended as soon as the monopoly ended. But during that period, they did all kind of things at public cost, you know, because it's a monopoly. So yes, it was technically private, but it was supported indirectly by taxes. Furthermore, they used wartime technology, which comes from the state sector, and procurement was from the government. For the first 10 years of production of transistors, around 1948 to 1958, all sophisticated transistors, 100% of them were bought by the government. Well, okay, that's the period in which they went through what's called the learning process, figuring out how to make the things cheaply and well enough so you can market them. Yeah, so that's the one case that wasn't obviously from the state sector. And if you look at biotechnology and anything else, it's exactly the same. The U.S. is not unique in this respect, but it's overwhelming. So yeah, it's called a free market economy, but very dynamic, crucial state sector. And of course, the parts that are supposedly private are themselves centrally managed inside big, conglomerates, corporations. It has no. If Adam Smith saw it, he would regard it as I don't know what. Certainly not a free market economy. It has nothing to do with classical economics. If you think about it, every firm, like even a mom and pop grocery store, is a violation of market principles. In fact, it's called that. There's some fancy name for it in economics courses. The Coast story got a Nobel Prize for talking about how you break market principles when transaction costs get too high and so on. But anything that's centrally managed, even if it's like a family store, violates market principles. When you get to a big firm, it's a huge violation. So yes, it's called a free market system, but that's just a joke.
That's probably one of the mistakes that you make a pretty persuasive case for the media and the military and the money that the forces behind globalization have and everything. I was wondering if you could, because sometimes I just feel like driving my car over a bridge or something and only living in the woods, but could you talk a little bit about like the weaknesses of?
Yeah, one of the weaknesses of the system is that the mostly reactionary governments of 80% of the world are opposed to it. That's a pretty strong force. Inside the industrial countries themselves, the majority is opposed. And you take a look at the polls. Any country for which we have data on public attitudes, they've remained quite consistently opposed. And the business world understands that. Actually, sometimes they reveal it in interesting ways. When one of the public victories in this, along with the MIA, another one was blocking fast track. When the fast track legislation was blocked, because Congress was in favor of it, but they were forced to vote against it just by public pressure. People were breaking down the doors of congressional offices and stuff. The Wall Street Journal had an interesting comment on this. They said, look, fast track is what they call a no-brainer. It's so obviously good, we just ram it through. But they said the trouble is opponents of fast track have what they called an ultimate weapon. The population's against it. And unless we can keep it secret and ram it through in secret, the ultimate weapon will be unsheathed. Well, that's no reason for despair. You've got the ultimate weapon on your side and most of the rest of the world. That's a lot of power. He's telling me I got to go.